50 Cent has been trolling Diddy ever since he got arrested, but most fans have no idea how serious the beef is. From 50 getting blackballed in the industry to his homies getting killed in the streets, Diddy's been around for it all, and today we're breaking down the whole crazy story.
You thought Netflix showed you the truth, but according to Diddy's own sons, what you watched was never the full picture. Christian and Justin Combs say the story the world consumed was shaped, edited, and pushed with a purpose.
Do you believe your father's innocent? Do you still convinced your father's innocent?
Your daddy got 4 years! Your daddy got 4 years for abusing women! That's wrong! He should get more!
Fight this to the end.
And the name they point to from the very beginning is 50 Cent. They say this didn't start with a documentary. It started years earlier, with proximity, rivalry, and ambition. According to the Sons, 50 Cent wasn't always an outsider. He was once close to their father, around the same circles, the same rooms, the same industry. But as time passed, one thing became impossible to ignore. Diddy kept rising: influence, power, control, while others watched from the sidelines. And the Sons claimed that gap mattered. They alleged that when fame stopped being equal, something changed. Admiration turned into comparison. Comparison turned into resentment. And resentment, when mixed with opportunity, turns dangerous. This is where they say the real story begins. In their new docuseries, Christian and Justin don't say their father was perfect. They don't claim innocence in everything. What they say instead is far more specific, that when their father was at his weakest, someone else saw a moment to win. They claim that when allegations surfaced, when headlines exploded, when public opinion was already leaning one way, 50 Cent didn't step back. He stepped in, with cameras, with platforms, with Netflix. According to the Sons, what followed wasn't an investigation. It was a narrative. They say clips were chosen for impact, not context. Moments were framed to provoke emotion, not understanding. And visuals were designed to leave one impression only: guilt. They allege that technology was used to enhance that impression. AI-assisted visuals, reconstructed sequences, dramatic pacing, all creating something that felt like truth, even if it wasn't complete. And once that image was planted, it spread faster than facts ever could. The Sons say this is how power works now. You don't need to prove everything. You just need to show enough to make people believe the worst. And according to them, belief was the real weapon. They claim 50 Cent understood that better than anyone, that by positioning himself as the storyteller, he became the authority, the one who didn't just comment on the downfall, but shaped it. In their words, this wasn't about exposing wrongdoing. It was about control. About who gets to define a legacy when the subject can no longer defend himself in public. And then came the silence. Christian and Justin describe watching people disappear. Friends, industry allies, names that once stood beside their father. Suddenly nowhere to be found. They say when the pressure hit, loyalty vanished. Phones stopped ringing, support dried up, and the narrative kept moving without resistance. That's the moment they say everything became clear. Not everyone wanted the truth. They wanted the outcome. So they made a decision, not to argue online, not to trade insults, not to beg for sympathy. They decided to document, to record what they saw from the inside, to explain what it feels like when the world decides who your father is, without ever asking the people who lived with him. They say this new documentary isn't meant to erase allegations or rewrite history. It's meant to show how quickly history can be written by those holding the camera. They claim the public never saw the full man, only the version that fit the moment. And now, for the first time, they're speaking, not as witnesses in a courtroom, not as names in headlines, but as sons. Sons who watched a narrative form in real time. Sons who watched influence overpower nuance. Sons who watched the industry choose distance over fairness. They say this is their response. Not to Netflix, not to headlines, but to the idea that one voice should decide everything. Because if they're right, if what they're saying holds weight, then this story was never just about Diddy. It was about who controls the truth when power shifts hands. And once that control is exposed, Nothing looks the same again. What the Suns describe next is the moment the pressure stopped being theoretical and became personal. They say the cameras didn't just document a downfall, they accelerated it. According to Christian and Justin, once the Netflix narrative took hold, everything around their father began to change at the same time. Not slowly, not gradually, all at once. Brand partners disappeared. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Projects that had been moving for years suddenly needed distance. And behind the scenes, they say, there was one constant feeling. Everyone was afraid of being on the wrong side of the story. They describe watching doors close before questions were even asked. And that's when they say the silence hurt more than the headlines. Because it wasn't strangers who vanished first. It was people who had eaten at their table, people who had built careers under their father's name, people who had called him family when things were good. The Suns say this is something the public never sees, how fast loyalty evaporates when perception turns toxic. They claim that while the world debated clips and documentaries, their family was dealing with something far more basic: isolation. Their father was no longer a person, he was a symbol, a headline, a verdict decided outside a courtroom. And according to them, that shift didn't happen naturally. It was engineered through repetition. They say once a single version of events dominates enough screens, it stops feeling like a story. It starts feeling like memory. People don't remember what actually happened. They remember what they were shown. This is where the Suns say the real damage was done, because even before any legal outcome, the public mind had already moved on. Judgment was no longer pending, it was settled. They describe sitting in rooms where people spoke about their father in past tense, as if everything was already over. And they say that's when they understood something important. This wasn't just about allegations anymore. It was about erasure. Erasing complexity, erasing history, erasing the parts of a human being that don't fit into a clean narrative arc. They claim the Netflix documentary didn't leave room for contradiction, or context, or unanswered questions. Everything moved in one direction, toward collapse. And according to the Suns, that direction benefited certain people. They don't accuse directly. Instead, they point to patterns. Who gained control of the conversation? Who gained cultural relevance? Who became the voice people trusted while their father was reduced to silence? They say in hip-hop, power has always shifted through perception. Through who gets framed as authentic, who gets framed as dangerous, who gets framed as disposable, and they claim this time was no different. Christian and Justin say they watched a familiar playbook unfold, not just against their father, but against legacy itself. When someone's influence grows too large, the fastest way to dismantle it isn't competition, it's moral collapse. Once the public believes you're beyond defense, everything else becomes irrelevant. They describe the weight of realizing that no explanation from their father would ever be heard the same way again. That every word would be filtered through a lens he didn't control. And that's when they made a choice, not to fight fire with fire, but to slow the story down. They say their documentary exists for one reason: to reintroduce time. Time to look at relationships instead of sound bites. Time to examine motives instead of montages. Time to separate what's known from what's assumed. They say they wanted to show moments the cameras missed. The pauses, the contradictions, the humanity that disappears when a story is cut for impact. And most importantly, they wanted to document what it feels like when your family becomes content. Because according to them, this was never just about exposing their father. It was about consuming him. They describe how quickly outrage turns into entertainment, how suffering becomes episodic, how real lives get edited into arcs designed to hold attention, not truth. And once that machine starts, it doesn't stop on its own. Someone has to interrupt it. That interruption, they say, is this documentary, not to tell people what to think, but to remind them that what they were shown wasn't the only version that existed. They don't ask the audience to choose sides. They ask them to question certainty. Because when stories are told at scale, the most dangerous thing isn't misinformation, it's confidence. Confidence that you've seen enough. Confidence that you understand everything. Confidence that there's nothing left to examine. The Suns say that confidence is exactly what allowed so many people to walk away without ever looking back. And now, as their story enters the conversation, they aren't trying to undo the past. They're trying to complicate it. Because once a narrative feels too clean, too simple, too final, that's usually when the truth is still missing. And if they're right, then this wasn't the end of a story. It was the moment a different one was silenced. What they confront next isn't the past, it's the future. Because once a narrative is released into the world, it doesn't just disappear. It lingers. It reshapes reputations. It rewrites legacies in real time. Christian and Justin say that's the part people underestimate. They describe realizing that even if facts change later, perception rarely does. Once the public locks onto a version of events, it becomes the reference point for everything that follows. Every update, every appeal, every silence. They say this is where their fear shifted. Not fear for headlines, but fear for history. Because according to them, their father's story wasn't just being criticized, it was being finalized. They talk about watching commentary solidify into certainty, analysts speaking with confidence, commentators drawing conclusions, strangers speaking as if they knew the man personally, all based on a version of events that moved faster than verification ever could. And they say something unsettling became clear. The louder the narrative got, the less space there was for correction. They describe how quickly nuance is treated like weakness, how hesitation gets labeled as guilt, how asking questions becomes suspicious instead of responsible. In that environment, silence isn't neutral, it's interpreted. They say their father understood that too well. Every word he could have said would have been dissected, twisted, reframed, used as confirmation instead of explanation. And so, like many before him, he became quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because the environment no longer allowed listening. The Suns say that silence was then used against him. They describe a cycle where absence becomes implication, and implication becomes assumed truth. And once that loop starts, it feeds itself. That's when they began thinking less about defense and more about documentation. They say they weren't trying to win an argument. They were trying to leave a record that acknowledges complexity, that shows contradiction, that admits uncertainty instead of erasing it. They describe going back through memories most people never saw, private moments, ordinary interactions, the spaces between public appearances that never make it into documentaries. Moments where their father wasn't a mogul or a symbol, just a person. They say those moments matter because they remind people of something uncomfortable. Real lives don't fit clean arcs. And they believe that's exactly why those moments were left out. Because complexity disrupts momentum. And momentum is what keeps narratives alive. They say the version of events pushed to the world moved too smoothly. No friction, no doubt. Just a steady march toward one conclusion. And that's when they began asking the question that changed everything for them. Who benefits from certainty? They don't answer it directly. They let the question sit. They talk about how quickly public attention turns into leverage. How being the loudest voice in a moment of chaos gives you authority, even if that authority was never earned. They say in hip-hop, image has always been power, and controlling image is the most effective form of control there is. According to them, that control didn't come from facts alone. It came from timing, releasing content when emotions were highest, when outrage was already primed, when people weren't looking to understand, only to react. They say that timing matters more than truth ever will, because once people feel something strongly enough, they stop looking for more information. They protect the belief they already formed, and that belief becomes identity. The Suns say that's what made this moment so dangerous, not because of what was said, but because of how completely it was absorbed. They describe realizing that the story had moved beyond their father. It had become a symbol for something larger, a vessel for anger, a cautionary tale, a headline people could project onto. And once someone becomes that, individuality disappears. They say their documentary doesn't try to reclaim sympathy, it tries to reclaim humanity. They want viewers to slow down, to notice what's missing, to question why some voices are amplified while others are erased. They say this isn't about asking people to change their minds. It's about reminding them they have one. Because the most dangerous moment in any cultural story is when everyone agrees too quickly. That's when power stops being questioned. That's when narratives stop being tested. That's when history starts getting written without witnesses. Christian and Justin say they don't know how the world will ultimately judge their father. What they know is this: judgment should come from understanding, not momentum. From evidence, not editing. From patience, not pressure. And as they place their version into the conversation, they aren't trying to close the story. They're trying to reopen it. Because once you realize how easily a narrative can be shaped, you start wondering how many others were shaped the same way. And that question doesn't just follow their father, it follows everyone who watched and believed without ever asking who was holding the camera. By the time the sons reach the final stretch of their story, the focus shifts again. Away from media, away from platforms, away from personalities, and toward consequences. They say this is the part no documentary wants to sit with long enough. Because narratives don't just shape opinion, they shape outcomes. Christian and Justin describe realizing that once a story reaches a certain scale, it begins to influence decisions far beyond public conversation. Business, institutions, even how people interpret silence or compliance. They say power doesn't always need to speak directly. Sometimes it just sets the tone, and everyone else adjusts accordingly. They talk about watching how quickly assumptions harden into reference points, how phrases repeated often enough started being treated like established facts, how speculation quietly replaced verification. And according to them, this is where the damage becomes invisible. Not loud, not explosive, but permanent. They describe understanding that their father's name would now always be preceded by an asterisk, a pause, a qualifier, something unspoken that follows him into every room, even rooms he's not in. They say that's the real weight of a controlled narrative. It doesn't end when the cameras turn off. It continues when no one is filming. They talk about legacy, not wealth, not influence, but memory, what people will remember, what future generations will inherit as truth. They say that's what finally pushed them to speak. Not anger, not revenge, but responsibility. Responsibility to the record. Because according to them, if no one interrupts the story while it's still forming, it hardens into history. And history rarely gets corrected. They describe moments during filming where they question themselves, whether speaking would make things worse, whether silence would be safer, whether opening old wounds would help or harm. But they say one question kept coming back. What happens if we don't say anything? They say they've seen how silence gets interpreted, how absence becomes agreement, how restraint gets reframed as weakness. And they didn't want their silence to become someone else's confirmation. They also acknowledge something else, something uncomfortable, that even their documentary will be judged, interpreted, dissected, accused of bias. They don't deny that. They say bias is unavoidable when you're human, when you're family, when you're inside the story instead of observing it from a distance. But they argue there's a difference between bias and intention. Their intention, they say, isn't to replace one narrative with another. It's to fracture certainty, to remind people that when stories feel too resolved, too neat, too confident, something is usually missing. They say the most honest stories leave room for doubt. They leave space for questions that don't have clean answers. And they believe the public deserves that space. Because once people are forced to choose between two extremes, hero or villain, truth or lie, they stop thinking critically. They start defending positions instead of examining facts. That's when narratives become tribal. They say they've watched that happen in real time. Comment sections turning into verdicts, opinions hardening into identities, nuance disappearing under certainty. And they believe that's exactly what makes this moment bigger than their family. Because if one narrative can move this fast, this decisively, this completely, then it can happen again. To anyone. They say that realization changed how they see media forever, not as neutral observers, but as participants with influence. Influence that comes with responsibility. A responsibility they believe wasn't handled carefully enough. As their story closes, they don't offer conclusions. They offer reminders. That power doesn't always look like authority. Sometimes it looks like storytelling. That truth doesn't always lose to lies. Sometimes it loses to timing. And that the most dangerous stories aren't the ones that are false, but the ones that feel complete before they're fully examined. They say their father's story is still unfolding. So is theirs. And now, so is the audience's role. Because once you've seen how a narrative can be built, you can never unsee it. The question isn't what you believe next. The question is whether you're willing to question at all. As the story moves forward, the sons stop talking about who controlled the past and start talking about who controls what comes next. They say this is where everything becomes uncomfortable. Because once a narrative is challenged, it doesn't disappear quietly. It pushes back. It tests resolve. It pressures anyone who steps out of line. They describe feeling that pressure almost immediately. Not always directly, not always publicly, but consistently. They say people began asking questions that weren't really questions. Suggestions disguised as concern. Warnings framed as advice. The kind that sound supportive on the surface, but carry a message underneath. Be careful. This is sensitive. This could backfire. They say those words told them everything, because if telling your own experience is considered dangerous, then the environment is already compromised. They talk about how quickly motives get assigned once you speak, how defending complexity gets mistaken for denial, how explaining context gets reframed as excuse-making. They say this is why so many people stay silent, not because they agree, but because they understand the cost of disagreement. And they admit something most people won't. That fear works. Fear of being misread, fear of being targeted next, fear of becoming part of the story instead of just reacting to it. They say that fear is how narratives maintain control long after release, because once people internalize it, no enforcement is necessary. The sons say they had to confront that fear directly. They describe moments where they questioned whether their voices would matter at all, whether people had already made up their minds, whether anything they said would simply be absorbed, reframed, and dismissed. But then they say they remembered something simple, that silence guarantees only one outcome. If you don't speak, someone else always will, and that voice won't hesitate to define you. They say this documentary was never about convincing everyone. It was about leaving something behind that couldn't be erased, a record that existed regardless of reception. Because even if people reject it today, tomorrow might look different. They talk about how narratives age, how stories that feel absolute in one moment often look incomplete years later, how certainty erodes once emotions cool, how questions resurface when distance creates perspective. They say history rarely stays settled. It waits. And when it revisits moments like this, it looks for what was ignored. They believe their role was to make sure something remained to be found. Not a defense, not a verdict, but a counterweight. Something that prevents the story from collapsing into a single angle. They also speak about something deeply personal, identity. They say growing up under a public figure means your reality is constantly filtered through other people's opinions. But this moment was different. This time, the opinions weren't just about their father, they were about them. They describe realizing that who they were allowed to be in the public eye would now be shaped by the same narrative, that their future would be interpreted through the same lens, unless they disrupted it. They say that realization made the decision unavoidable, because narratives don't stop at their targets. They ripple outward. They shape families. They shape children. They shape what people assume before you ever speak. And the sons say they refuse to inherit silence. As they near the end of their story, they don't ask for sympathy. They ask for patience. Patience to sit with uncertainty. Patience to separate evidence from emphasis. Patience to recognize how easily confidence replaces curiosity. They say if there's one thing they hope viewers take away, it's this: that stories told at scale demand skepticism, not cynicism, but care. Because believing everything you're shown isn't trust, it's surrender. They don't claim to hold the truth. They claim the truth deserves more time than it was given. And as their voices enter the conversation, they aren't closing anything. They're slowing it down, creating space where none existed. Because once you understand how fast narratives can form, you start realizing how rare reflection really is. And reflection, they say, is the only place truth ever survives. As the sons move closer to the end of their story, they stop talking about media, platforms, or pressure and start talking about something far more difficult to confront: irreversibility. They say there's a moment in every public collapse when you realize nothing will ever return to how it was. Not reputations, not relationships, not how people look at your name when it appears on a screen. They describe reaching that realization quietly, not during a headline, not during a viral clip, but in the still moments after, when the noise fades and what's left is permanence. They say that's when they understood the true cost of narrative control. Because even if time reveals inconsistencies, even if questions resurface, even if certainty weakens, damage doesn't rewind. Perception doesn't reset. They talk about how narratives don't just change how the world sees someone. They change how someone sees the world. Trust becomes conditional. Intentions get questioned. Silence feels dangerous. Speech feels risky. They say watching their father navigate that shift changed how they understand power forever. Not as something loud or obvious, but as something quiet that rearranges reality without asking permission. They describe moments where their father seemed smaller, not defeated, but aware. Aware that no explanation could compete with repetition. Aware that every attempt to clarify would be filtered through an expectation already formed. And they say that awareness is its own kind of confinement. They also talk about memory, how moments from years ago suddenly get reinterpreted, how past actions are relabeled through present narratives, how history bends to match whatever story is most convenient now. They say that's when legacy becomes fragile. Because legacy isn't what you did, it's what people remember you did. And memory, once shaped at scale, is almost impossible to reclaim. They described feeling the weight of knowing that their father's name would now live inside conversations he'd never hear, opinions he'd never answer, judgments he'd never face directly. They say that's when the story stopped being abstract. It became generational. Because whatever version of events survives this moment won't stop with him. It will follow them, their children, their future. They talk about realizing that silence doesn't just affect one person, it echoes forward. And they weren't willing to let that echo go unanswered. They say this is why their documentary doesn't chase resolution, it accepts uncertainty. They believe uncertainty is more honest than certainty built too fast, more responsible than conclusions drawn under pressure. They say the world is uncomfortable with unresolved stories, so it rushes to finish them, to label, to close, to move on. But real life doesn't move that cleanly, and neither does truth. They talk about how easy it is to confuse confidence with accuracy, how authority gets mistaken for objectivity, how a well-produced narrative can feel more real than reality itself. They say that illusion is what makes this moment so dangerous. Because when storytelling becomes indistinguishable from truth, accountability disappears. No one asks who chose the frame. No one asks who benefited from timing. No one asks what was left out. They say this documentary exists to reintroduce those questions, not loudly, not aggressively, but persistently. They want viewers to sit with discomfort instead of rushing to judgment, to notice when a story feels too polished, too decisive, too complete. They believe real stories leave scars, rough edges, contradictions, and when those are missing, something has been smoothed over. They don't pretend their version fills every gap. They say it simply proves gaps exist. As they near the end of their account, the sons don't sound angry. They sound resolved, resolved to live with complexity instead of fighting it, resolved to let questions exist without forcing answers, resolved to speak once, clearly, and let time do the rest. Because time, they believe, is the only force that eventually challenges narratives built on momentum alone. They say truth doesn't always arrive first, but it tends to arrive last. And when it does, it looks very different from certainty. It looks like reconsideration, like hesitation, like a second look. They don't know when that moment will come. They only know that when it does, they wanted something to already be there, waiting, not to persuade, but to remind that before the story was closed, someone chose to leave it open. By the time their story reaches its final moments, the sons no longer sound like they're responding to anyone. They sound like they've accepted something deeper. That once a narrative escapes into the world, you don't get to chase it forever. You don't get to correct every misunderstanding. You don't get to reclaim every lost moment. At some point, you stop arguing with the noise and decide what you're willing to stand for without applause. They say this is where they landed. Not in certainty, not in victory, but in clarity. Clarity about what they can control and what they can't. They can't control how people interpret their father's past. They can't control how media cycles move. They can't control who believes which version of events. But they can control whether silence becomes the final word. They say that's all this ever was, a refusal to disappear quietly. They talk about the temptation to keep responding, to keep reacting, to keep chasing every new angle as it appears. But they realize something important. Endless response is still submission, because it keeps you trapped inside someone else's frame. So instead, they chose to speak once, deliberately, and step back, to let their perspective exist without begging for acceptance. They say there's a strange peace in that decision. Not peace because the situation is resolved, but peace because they no longer feel erased. They also speak about accountability, not the kind demanded by headlines, but the kind that comes from looking honestly at complexity, from admitting that people can be flawed without being fictional, that harm and humanity can exist in the same story. They say the world doesn't like that idea. It prefers absolutes, heroes or villains, clean endings, but real lives resist that structure, and so does truth. They don't claim their documentary will change minds overnight. They don't expect forgiveness, agreement, or closure. What they expect is time. Time for emotions to cool. Time for certainty to soften. Time for people to revisit what they thought they already understood. They believe that's when stories reveal what they were missing. They also say something quietly profound, that this experience changed how they see power forever. Not as fame, not as money, not as reach, but as the ability to slow things down, to interrupt momentum, to create space where none existed. They believe that's the most radical thing they could do. Not shout louder, not escalate, but pause the story long enough for people to notice its edges. As their voices fade from the narrative, they leave behind no demand, only an invitation. To question why certain stories feel inevitable. To notice who benefits when certainty arrives too fast. To remember that being confident about a story isn't the same as understanding it. They say if viewers walk away with anything, they hope it's discomfort, because discomfort means you're thinking. And thinking is where power loses its grip. They don't end by asking who was right. They end by asking something far more difficult. Who decided? Because once you start asking that question, not just here, but everywhere, you realize how many stories you accepted without ever knowing who shaped them. And that realization doesn't just change how you see this case. It changes how you see the world. Once control disappears, consequences don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly. And by the time you notice them, the story has already moved on. The only thing left is whether you followed it or finally stopped to think.